What's up, guys? This is Mitch Mann. Welcome to another episode of the Wake Boat Show. We are going to be talking today about a very unique subject, and kind of bear with me because this is a new format that we haven't really tried before, and I'm going to try to do my very best in this one. But this comes as a request from a lot of people for a lot of different information. We published a lot of information in the past about Centurion boats and about boats in general, and about how Centurions and Supreme boats compare to different other boat brands and things of that nature. Well, today we're going to take a little bit of a different spin on it. And this is just going along with the desire and need to try and help get you information that will be helpful for just having a better understanding of what we are talking about. There's a lot of things regarding towboats that are not well understood. And the goal here is just to give you a better viewpoint on that information. Hopefully it's helpful. And so please let us know if you really like this format. Let us know if you really like what we're talking about today, and if you want us to continue doing stuff like this in the future. So for those of you who may not be aware, I run and operate one of the largest Centurion and Supreme boat dealerships in the world. We publish a lot of content regarding Centurion and Supreme boats. We try to be as objective as possible. The information I convey out here on these videos is really what I think, really how I feel. There is obviously some bias built into it, and that's just because I'm biased towards Centurion and Supreme. But I think I've done a pretty good job covering, if you've actually watched the other content that I've made here, that I try to do my very best to be objective and to draw and showcase the advantages and disadvantages of all boats, and in particular when we do comparison videos with Centurion and Supreme, to identify areas and places where other boats do a better job than they're done on Centurions and Supremes. And I wanted to have that as a segue to lead into what we're talking about today, because it's a really unique topic and discussion. And that is that I'm wanting to take two different boat companies and two different boat brands and put them head to head against each other and talk to you about what I think, how they work as far as comparing and contrasting between the two different brands, and where each one has advantages, one versus another. But these are two boat brands I have absolutely no connection or affiliation with whatsoever. I have no incentivization for either of these boat brands, and that is Malibu and Mastercraft. And you could go buy a Malibu, you could go buy a Mastercraft. It does not matter to me, honestly, which one you do. I have no dog in this fight. This is just my opinions and just hopefully information that will help you to understand differences. And particularly if you're wondering what my viewpoints are that are unbiased, with these, I can't say because we all have biases, but I have no incentivization to give you inaccurate or misleading information in this. Not that the information that we give in any of the other videos is misleading or not correct in any way. We really try to do our very best to be as objective as we possibly can. So, going through and comparing and contrasting Malibu and Mastercraft. Why am I picking these two brands? Well, first off, and very clearly, the most important reason why I'm comparing and contrasting these two is that they are the two largest boat manufacturers. They're the two largest brands within the towboat space. And so this is just a very clear one. And it's one that is a very easy comparison between the two. And it's one that if you're out looking around at information, you're considering one of these two different brands. If you're looking at Mastercraft and open to shopping other brands, chances are Malibu is probably on that list, and vice versa. So that's why I'm starting with these two. Going to be talking about this. And so if you like what we're talking about today and this is helpful and informative, let us know. We're happy to cover additional brands similar to this in the future. So with all that being said, let's dive in and talk about Malibu and Mastercraft. So as I mentioned, they're the two largest boat brands in our industry. They both do a great job. They both build a fantastic boat. And we're going to talk about how they compare and contrast against each other. And one important thing I want to hit on before I dive into the specific details about these two boat brands is that each one is going to have strengths and weaknesses. And this is the case with all boat brands. In fact, if you watch a lot of the other content that we talk about, I talk about how that there's areas where, let's say, a Mastercraft boat is superior to a Centurion boat. And there's ways that a Mastercraft is superior to an Nautique. There's ways that a Malibu is superior to a Mastercraft and superior to a Supra or any of the other different brands that are out there. There's areas that each one of these boats will be better than others at. There's areas where they will not be as strong. And there's going to be areas where there's just differences between the two. And there's not necessarily a better or worse. It's going to be specific to your personal preferences that might be better for you, but it might be worse for me. And so I'm going to run through each of those. Tied into that, I'm going to give you my opinions. And these opinions are just mine. They are not the opinions of BoardCo or any other organization or anything that I'm affiliated with or work. They're certainly not the opinions of Centurion. I don't ever speak for them. But they aren't the opinions of Malibu or Mastercraft for that regard. They're just my opinions of being somebody who's been involved in this industry for just about 30 years now and has probably been on more towboats than most other people ever will in their lifetime. So kind of having that as a precedent, let's talk about the two different boat brands. Now, first I wanted to talk about just the brand positioning and the overall brand structure between these two different boats. So you have Mastercraft has basically their boat lineup is broken down into 4 divisions. And we're going to primarily be talking about 3 of the 4. And I'll get to that in just one second. But the 4 divisions that their boats are segmented and broken up by is they have the Star Series, which I'll get to in just a second. But then their boats are going from top to bottom, from highest end to lower end. They have the X Series, the NXT Series, and the NXT Series. So the X Series, the XT Series, the NXT Series. So basically, as you add a letter, X, XT, NXT, it gets lower end. Why they do it that way, I have no idea. There might actually be a reason. If you know what it is, please comment. I'd love to know that, actually. So you have those different series of boats. Then they have the Star Series, which they really run as a different series. Really what it is the Star. They have a X Star, which is essentially just a 23-foot X Series boat. That's really what it is. It's got some very slight differences that are different from the X Series boat, but they're minor enough that I'm just lumping it in saying, nope, that's an X23 for all intents and purposes. I say X23 because they have an X22, they have an X24. It's a 23-foot X Series boat. Performs like one, looks like one, operates like one. It's a 23-foot X Series boat. The other boat in the Star Series is the Pro Star. That, in my opinion, is the best boat Mastercraft builds by a landslide. But I'm a little biased in that regard. It's their purebred slalom water ski boat. 99% of you could not care less about that boat. But it's actually a really great ski boat. But we're not going to be talking about that one today. We may do a future episode where we compare the different water ski specific boats between, Malibu, Mastercraft, Nautique, but this is not going to be what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to put the Pro Star aside. We're going to lump the X Star into the X Series family. So just be aware, that's what I'm going to be referring to. So for all intents and purposes today, there's 3 different series of boats, X, XT, and NXT. When you contrast that over to Malibu's side of things, Malibu has 2 really clearly defined segments. And then within one of them, within each of them, there's just some kind of different monikers and some different series that are a little more convoluted. So Malibu it does something a little different than Mastercraft in that they have their boats broken up actually into 2 brands. They have Malibu and they have Axis. Now, a lot of you are familiar with this, but Malibu and Axis operate in a very similar regard to Toyota and Lexus. One is a higher-end boat. The other one's a lower-end boat. They both sit on the same factory line. They both are assembled essentially the same way, built the same way, engineered the same way. They operate very similarly to one another. One's just higher-end and nicer and has more bells and whistles. One has less. So that's Malibu versus Axis. And that's the way that most boat brands do it. Mastercraft's kind of an interesting one in which that they have their NXT series, which is really what would compete against an Axis. It's still lumped in as a Mastercraft. Other boat brands do similar to what Malibu does. So Centurion has Supreme, Moomba and Supra are sister companies, Taiga and ATX. There's a number of these different brands that are out there. But Malibu and Axis are 2 different boat brands under the same manufacturer. The reason they do that is they wanted to be able to do Axis a little differently, have it not cannibalize Malibu sales, really not degrade the Malibu name, I would say, but some of the stuff that they were doing on Axis boats that was cheaper. It probably is one way to phrase it. Please don't be mad at me the way I'm describing some of these things. It's still not a cheap boat. We're still, in excess of $100,000 for these things. They're not cheap, but they downgraded the quality of a certain level. and when you go to an Axis. And so that they really wanted to separate the brands. Mastercraft took a different approach. People can argue whether it's better or worse, but they have NXT that's lumped in with the other Mastercraft boats, which provides some interesting things from a market study. This is just dealing with the towboat market in general, that I'll just hit on in just a second. But that's the breakdown between them. Is you have Malibu has their two major segments of Malibu and Axis, and then within each one of those they have some different series. Within Axis they have the A and the T. Within Malibu they have the MXZ and the LSV. What these are just referring to is just what shape of bow it is. There may be some slight other differences between them, but that's really what they're talking about. An MXZ, like a 23 MXZ and a 23 LSV, are very similar boats. The biggest difference between them is just the shape of the bow, which can be kind of confusing for some people, but you don't need to go in a whole lot deeper than that. That's what it is. That's the majority of the difference between them. Now, Malibu will also, on the LSV series boats, something a lot of people don't really know is that they do have different hull designs that you can pick from. They have a diamond hull and they have a wake series hull. The main difference is the wake series is a better wakeboard, wake surf hull. The diamond hull is a better crossover. In other words, it's going to water ski better. They're not that different from one another. They're actually fairly similar hull shapes. There's nothing radically different about the wake series hull that puts it in the category of like something different like a Nautique G series hull, or something even more radically different like a Centurion Opta V hull. Nothing like that. They're just minor differences with how they run and how they move through the water with the wake hull versus the diamond hull. So that is something that's available on the LSVs. A lot of people aren't even aware that that's a thing, but they do have that, and it's actually kind of convoluted and confusing. And then they do have, within Malibu, they have another series called the M series, which currently is the M220 and the M240. That's the real upper echelon series boats that would really compete against Mastercraft's X series boats. So Mastercraft has the X series, Malibu has the M series. Then Malibu has a whole bunch of stuff that sits in the middle with the LSVs and the MXZs. And Mastercraft has their XTs that compare against one another. And then Mastercraft's NXT will compare against Axis boats. So when you're comparing and contrasting, that's really what we're going to be talking about. If I'm talking about Malibu versus Mastercraft, just understand I'm going to be talking like M series versus X series, or LSV series versus Mastercraft XT series. I'm not going to try and compare like a Mastercraft X series versus an Axis, or a Malibu M series versus a Mastercraft NXT. The differences are just too broad. In some cases, you could be talking about one boat that is more than double the price tag of one of these others. So big differences between them. And I'm not going to get into the real nitty-gritty differences between like an X series versus an XT versus an NXT. Just know that I'm going to be comparing straight across. We might sometime dive into that a little bit deeper, but we'll only do that if it's really super beneficial and helpful. So just know that if there's a exception to that rule where the direct comparison of series wouldn't apply, I'll identify that, but just assume that that's the case as we're talking about things. Now, from a brand positioning standpoint, and this is reflected a lot in the lines I just discussed and covered, what you end up seeing is where these different boat brands are strongest in the marketplace. So Mastercraft historically, especially going through like the 2000s, like 2000 to 2010, they were kind of the top dog in the industry. They built the most number of boats. They were generally considered to be the ultra premium model of boats. And then as time went on, they came out with their new model designators. They came out with like the NXT series that was their more budget line, Mastercraft, that they then, inserted into the Mastercraft brand. And then as adjusted, came out with the XT series in conjunction, where previous back in like the early 2000s, it was basically just straight X series boats. That's all they built. Now they had lower end X series and higher end X series, and it was honestly really confusing because people had no idea what they were looking at. So they drew much clearer lines now between X, XT, and NXT than what they had previously. But going along with that, and going along with the idea of having an NXT Mastercraft, what has happened is if you look at market segmentation, Mastercraft still builds a very large number of boats, but their boats are progressively shifting in the direction of NXT. In other words, whatever percentage of their production line looks like, It's shifting more and more to NXTs, a little bit less to the XT series, and less to the X series boats. So their dominance as the premier high-end luxury towboat has really eroded a fair bit over time, at least in my view. And that's something that's been replaced primarily by Nautique. There's other brands that have come in and really taken a big chunk of that. Centurion with their RI series has taken a big chunk of that. And some other different brands have come in, like Supra's done a little bit, Taiga's done a little bit. But that's good. And even Malibu's done a little bit with their M series, coming in and taking some of that ultra premium segment that Mastercraft was really known for. Malibu, on the other side, they have a couple ultra premium towboats in that M series. They don't build nearly as many of them as some of the other manufacturers. Like, there's not nearly as many M220s built as there is like Nautique G23s. But they're trying to make some inroads into that ultra premium market. Malibu's the real meat and potatoes of Malibu, where they compete heavily across the board, is in that mid-range segment. The LSV, the MXZ series boats, and the stuff that would compare against like a Mastercraft XT series, and how they compare and contrast side by side. So that's going to be where Malibu's really, really strong. They build a lot of boats in that segment. They're by a wide margin the largest manufacturer in the world for that specific product segment, and they do a really good job. They significantly outpace what Mastercraft does with their XT series, as well as outpace like Supra. They outpace Centurion's FI series. They outpace Nautique's S series boats, things in that regard. So, and that's just because that's really where they put a lot of their focus. And then over time, they've put a lot of focus on Axis as well. And that one's doing fairly well. And that's where Malibu's real strength has been in the lower end segment with Axis and in the mid-range segment with Malibu, with a few things in that ultra premium end, but they don't play in it as much as Mastercraft does, or as much as some of the other brands, as a percentage, such as Centurion and Nautique. So that's where they're sitting from a marketplace standpoint. Now, why am I comparing an X series against an M series and an XT against a Malibu 23 LSV, or sorry, not 23, just Malibu LSVs or whatever? The main reason why is just price tag. So if you're comparing them, you could compare an X24 against a Malibu 24 MXZ, but there's a decent probability that you're going to have a pretty notable price difference between those two boats. And so it wouldn't be as fair as, let's say, comparing a Mastercraft XT24 to a 24 MXZ. Those are going to be a lot more in line with each other price-wise. There's obviously going to be differences plus or minus, but you're not going to see $100,000 swing from one to the other. It's not a gigantic price gap between these different models, as long as you line up the right series properly. So, with that being said, let's dive into the real nitty-gritty of the differences between these boats and how they compare against one another and what my opinions are. So we're going to first start with the interior features of the boats. And this, what I'm going to be talking about first is what a lot of you would potentially refer to as fit and finish, or at least what a lot of dealers would call fit and finish. But what I'm going to be talking about is the build quality of the boats and the features and design elements on the interior of the boats and even the exterior, but the ones that don't specifically have to deal with performance. We'll talk about performance a little bit later. But we're going to be talking about things that are elements that you'll probably see in a dealership showroom or at a boat show or something along those lines, not necessarily something you need to be on the water to experience. So we're going to start with those aspects. Now, when we're talking about them, let's first talk about what I think are the strengths of, we'll first start with Malibu, the different strengths that Malibu has in comparison to Mastercraft. Malibu does a really good job at some of the just different little bells and whistles and frills that they put throughout the boat. And when I say good job, that doesn't necessarily mean I like all of these, but it means that there's certain elements or aspects that I think can have a lot of appeal to certain people. Examples of this would be some of their machined parts that they put in their boats are just really top notch. And this could be everything from like their seat bracketry for like the sliding center bench seat, as an example. Some of the different pieces with their grab handles, some of the different parts with their towers and that. those machined elements are really good. Malibu and Mastercraft both actually machine all of their own parts, to my knowledge, understanding, or at least the vast majority of them. And so they both actually do a really good job. And if I were to identify one area that I think that actually both Malibu and Mastercraft do better than all the other manufacturers, this would be on that list. So it would be their machine parts. And they each have strengths or weaknesses compared to one another. But that's one area that Malibu does a great job, is some of their machined parts. They also have a lot of other different little niceties, I would call it. Things such as like misters that are available on the tower. I personally think it's not the best innovation, and one that is potentially fraught with a lot of issues that I would not put on my boat if I was building a Malibu. But nevertheless, they do have some of those different little features that they've implemented that can be really nice. They have some other different design elements that some people might really like they have flip down seats that are on like the back bench seat to make it so you can climb in and out a little bit easier without stepping on vinyl. You're still kind of stepping on vinyl, but you're putting a hard piece in between you and the vinyl, so it may save your seats. Seems like an odd option to me, but it is something that some people I think may really like or really appreciate in the boats. The other thing that a few other pieces that I think Malibu does a great job with is that the towers are really strong. They're well done. They look pretty good, in my opinion, as well as they do a good job on a lot of the other different niceties or trim pieces on the interior of the boat, particularly like your side panels where you have cell phone holders and some other different things that can be really nice features that other people really like. Places where I think Mastercraft wins, just in my opinion, fairly clearly, their seat ergonomics, in my opinion, are not just better than Malibu's; they're the best in the industry. They do just a really nice job with how they have their seats feel. Particularly if you're talking about in a showroom or at a boat show, less so when you're out on the water when it's hot temperatures. They do a really soft foam in the seats that is really comfy when you sit in it. Over time, it will wear out a lot faster and it will bottom out much easier. So it may not be that comfy and that nice when you're out in 90 to 100 degrees, but when you're in a nice 70-degree showroom, it sure is really nice and comfortable when you compare it to other different boat brands, and in particular Malibu. Other different things that I think Mastercraft does really well, they have some other different pieces like their Decadence flooring that's an option. You don't have to go with this. You can have like your soft grip or C-deck flooring, in which case I think Mastercraft C-deck is slightly better than Malibu's soft grip. At least in the past, Malibu's done a soft grip flooring that's kind of their own branded stuff that they have built out of China. Mastercraft uses C-deck, which I think is a little bit nicer, but they also do have a flooring called Decadence. If you haven't seen it, it's kind of like a sponge. It's really hard to describe to anybody, but it's almost like a mix between sponge and AstroTurf and snapping carpet. I actually really like it. It works pretty well. A lot of people don't, but it does have some really nice functionality. It doesn't hold water. You can just hose right through it. So there's some advantages to that, and it's kind of cushy and comfy, but some people absolutely hate it. That is something that's a feature that Mastercraft does that's kind of nice. Mastercraft also, this is just my personal thing. They also do teak platforms. I think they're standard, actually. So they're teak wood on the back swim platform instead of being fiberglass like every other boat manufacturer. I'm just old school because I've been doing this for a really long time. I actually kind of like the teak platform. And if I was building a Mastercraft, I would put that on my boat. But it's a lot of maintenance. It's kind of a more nostalgic thing. It's not necessarily more functional. But that is something that some people will go through that you can opt for on a Mastercraft. And like I said, I potentially would. The other area that I think Mastercraft is the winner on, and this is not necessarily the case for every boat series, but if you're talking about their X series boats, and if you do the optional backrest for the XT series boats, their transom seating or their seating at the back of the boat is really nice. And in my opinion, probably the nicest in the industry, with the exception of Nautique's Paragon. But they do a really nice job with those back seats and the backrests that flip up and are exposed. They do eat up some of your storage space, so that is a little bit of a trade-off that you got to keep in mind. But those areas are ones that Mastercraft, I think, does a very nice option or nice job with. The other area where I think Mastercraft does walk away with doing better overall is with their vinyl, particularly if you do their Cool Touch vinyl. It's not as strong as the vinyl that's available in some other boats, such as Centurion or Nautique, but it's right in line with Malibu's vinyl. It's a better, Mastercraft just does a nicer job, and tactile-wise, as far as just the touch and feel of it, it's nicer than Malibu's. That's my opinion. But it also dissipates heat a lot better than what Malibu's does with their Cool Touch vinyl. So in particular, if you wanted to have really dark colored seats, like a dark brown or black or something like that, Mastercraft does a very nice job in doing a vinyl that will dissipate heat. The downside to that Cool Touch material is it is not as durable. But both, like I said, are fairly similar durability-wise between it and Malibu. Not nearly as robust as some of the vinyls that are available from some of the other premium manufacturers. But so between those two, because of the heat dissipation and because of the way it feels, I personally am a fan of Mastercraft's vinyl in comparison. Now, there's other aspects on the interior of these boats that's just going to come down to what you feel and think and what you prefer. So great examples of this are, number one, your center seat configuration. In Mastercraft, they've got like basically a flip around seat. In other words, you pick it up and it pivots and drops in back a notch. From a flip around functionality, it's, in my opinion, probably the nicest, easiest one that there is in the industry. The downside is it's not as, you can't slide it further up into the boat as effectively. So it's not as easy to get up underneath shade coverage. This is one area I actually like Malibu's design a little bit better, at least on their newer series of boats, like the 25 and the 26 LSV and things of that nature. That's got like a flip around back bench area that you can also flip down and turn into a table design. It's a really well thought out option and well thought out system. It's on a sliding track system that's similar a lot to like Centurion's, but they do that flip around back system that has a built-in table. It's a pretty well done thing. I remember when I first saw that design when they came out with it a few years ago, I was like, that's a really well done and well engineered system that they did in their boats. So I prefer that one, but there's other people that would like Mastercraft's design better, especially if you want to lay it down and create like an ottoman design or a bed or something. That's where Mastercraft is going to be a bit better. So there's pluses and minuses to each one. Similar type of thing to that is what I mentioned previously, which is things such as the storage layout in the boats. With Mastercrafts, if you have those rear transom seats, it eats up some of your rear storage lockers. Malibu doesn't really have that much storage in the rear lockers if you do the plug and play bags in the rear, which, as far as I'm concerned, like every Malibu owner should do. Otherwise, you just end up with a subpar Surfwave. But if in a Mastercraft, if you have those back rear seats, they do take up some of your storage space, but they are kind of a nice, cool hangout lounge area. So the next thing I want that it ties in on the inside that I wanted to hit on is the dash system. So between them, Malibu, I think, has done a better job aesthetically with their dash presence and the overall design and ergonomics of their dash and their helm. They have a better stereo controller, I believe, and a really neat driver keypad that they have that's got the dial for dialing in your volume, having a couple quick access buttons for your surf settings and things of that nature. That's one area that I think Malibu does an exceptional job, and they have for a really long time. They do a great job with that helm design. Mastercraft, however, I do think their dash system is significantly more functional. You have a lot more controls. You have a lot more functionality that designs in there. I actually think the Mastercraft does arguably the best job in the industry with their dash software systems. I don't know anything about their reliability or whatnot, but just as far as the way that they function and operate, and the different things that you can do with that dash system and the ease of navigating the menus, I think that they're right in line with, they have this similar ease of use, not quite as good as Centurion's, but they have more functionality than, like, let's say a Centurion dash does, and more than most of the other manufacturers that are out there, and also have that nice user functionality. Where Malibu's is kind of more cumbersome to navigate. Those of you guys that are big Malibu fans, don't get mad at me about this. I'm sorry. I'm not saying it's hard to navigate. I'm saying it's not as easy as Mastercraft's. So it's not bad. It's just not as good as Mastercraft's from a ease of use standpoint. And Malibu does a really great job on dressing things up more than they do making them actually really functional from a user interface, where Mastercraft is a bit more on the functional side of things. And I think they just do a really nice job. in that regard. As far as the helm design itself, I think that Mastercraft has a more comfortable seat. I think it's got a really nicely designed helm area. Just that, honestly, the only thing that Malibu, I think, does a superior job is having that additional keypad function. It's really nice. But aside from that, I think Mastercraft's helm is overall better designed. Now, when you're talking about the other thing I wanted to hit on that is similar to this, that's kind of in the inside of the boat, but kind of not, is the tower design. So there's advantages and disadvantages to each one of these different towers. Personally, I think that Mastercraft design, especially with the folding functionality of the towers, is a better design system than Malibu's. Mastercraft's Bimini is easier to deploy. Malibu has a nicer Bimini, so there's a little bit of a trade-off there. I actually would prefer Malibu's system there. Board racks are going to be actually pretty much 6s between the two. If anything, I'd probably go Malibu's. They have a PTM system. Mastercraft kind of does their own. I don't love Mastercraft's lever lock system, even though I think it's probably more functional from a holding your board in standpoint. I just don't like the mechanisms that it uses. Neither one of these is as nice as some of the systems that are done by some of the other boat manufacturers like Nautique or Centurion, but they both do a decent job as far as the racks go on the boats. The one exception being Mastercraft does clamping racks on everything, where Malibu, you still can do bungee board racks if you want to save a few bucks and go with something a little bit cheaper. Please don't do bungee board racks. Like, just don't do them. They're sad. Don't get whacked in the eye with a bungee. Just get clamping board racks. Don't buy bungee ones, regardless of what company or what brand your boat you're getting. So really, when you're comparing and contrasting these two different pieces between the towers, most of the difference you're going to notice is going to be aesthetics. There's not major functionality benefits of one versus another. Even when you go to like the power towers and all the other things, they're just not that different from a functionality standpoint. It's more an aesthetic and a looks thing. Now, when you're talking about aesthetics, I think there's actually advantages to each one. Some people absolutely hate the Mastercraft hump that sits and like the midsection of the boat or towards the back end. I personally don't hate it. Doesn't really bother me, and I think the boats look really nice. Some people just absolutely hate the way that looks. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of the new Malibu boat designs, I think, are really nicely done. They've got a lot more chisel lines on them than they used to. Overall, as far as the rest of the stuff on the outside, gel coat wise, Mastercraft just does a better job with gel coat. Mastercraft arguably does the best job of gel coat of any boat brand in the industry, but they just have an overall better gel coating process. I would say it's them and Centurion do the best job. Malibu would kind of fit in line next. That would probably be tied in with like Supra and Taiga and that. Surprisingly enough, I actually think Nautique's gel coating is not as good as some of the others, which is what you can see with some of the body lines and things like that they do. They don't do as sharp defined graphics as some of the other manufacturers. But that's something Mastercraft does a great job on gel coat. So and typically their quality control that I see coming out of a Mastercraft factory on the newer boats is nicer and higher than Malibu's is. Malibu's quality control is not nearly as robust as some of the other manufacturers in the industry. So that's something when we're talking about the inside of the boats, the outside of the boats. The one thing I didn't hit on a ton was just the overall build quality and design of the boats. Personally, this one, and this is something going off of a lot of experience, knowing a lot about manufacturing processes and things of that nature. Mastercraft just builds an overall better boat. It's better materials. It's more refined processes on how they're put together. Though everything from the way the boat's laminated to the different components and different aspects of things that go into the boat. Now, does that mean everything on a Mastercraft is better than a Malibu? No. There's aspects and areas where Malibu, I would say, does an equal or better job. But if we're talking an overall build quality, I would give that one to Mastercraft. Now, once again, if you're a Malibu guy, don't get mad at me for saying that. I'm not saying Malibu is a poorly built boat or anything of that nature. It's just not nearly as well constructed as a Mastercraft. This is much more evident when you start looking at NXT versus Axis. An NXT boat, even though I don't think the build quality is super great on those, is definitely not an X series. But it's still a fair bit better than what you get on an Axis. It's just not as cheap, it's not as flimsy, and the materials are not as low grade. Though there are aspects of Mastercraft that are not as high grade, like that foam that I mentioned that's really soft and cushy. It's also, I believe, the least expensive foam, at least if they're using the same stuff that they were previously. is the least expensive foam you can really put in the boats, shockingly enough. So a lot of people just assume higher end equals more expensive. That's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you get lower grade materials because they're better from a marketing perspective, which is what it is with Mastercraft. So talked about that, some of the different interior features of the boats, different designs and things. Let's dive into the stuff that you guys think is that is probably the most important for most of you, and that is the performance aspects of the boats, how they're going to surf, wakeboard, water ski, things of that nature. So probably one of the first things we need to hit on is the design philosophy between these different boats, and that is this. Malibu designs and runs their boats using two different systems that are very different than what Mastercraft operates. The first one is that they have a wedge system, where Mastercraft uses a traditional plate system that sits at the back of the boat. And then the second one is Malibu uses a gate-style surf system versus a hybrid tab system, which is what Mastercraft operates on theirs. Now, we've done a whole other series talking specifically about surf systems, so I'm just going to brush on it and not dive into it too deeply. But Malibu boats are going to say that having that wedge and having the amount of ballast that is available in a Malibu in combination, you're going to end up creating, generally speaking, you're going to create more displacement than what you get with a Mastercraft comparably equipped. So like a 23 LSV Malibu is going to displace more water for surfing or wakeboarding than what you get with a Mastercraft XT23. So that's going to be the differences between those two from just an overall performance philosophy. Now, there's aspects to them that are going to be pluses and minuses between like something, let's say the Surf Star system that Mastercraft does and Malibu's Surf Gate system. So the difference is Surf Gate is a gate or a brake style system that deploys out the side, slows down one side of the boat, creates delayed convergence, and creates a surfable wave on the side that you're not engaging that plate on. Mastercraft, rather, the plate deploys downwards, and Mastercraft's plate has kind of a hook grabbing mechanism that is a kind of like a combination between a true tab plate system like a Centurion Quick Surf and Malibu's Surf Gate system. The advantages and the disadvantages. The advantage to Malibu's system is that it's going to be faster wave transfers side to side. It's also going to be slightly less weight sensitive. Mastercraft system is going to be slightly more weight sensitive, but it's also going to create significantly less drag than Malibu's system, the Malibu Surfgate system is. It's also going to give you a lot more wave adjustability and manipulation. So you have the ability to customize and control the shape of the wave. Now, something I hear all the time from people is from Malibu owners or people that are affiliated with Malibu is, no, Malibu's got a super customizable surf wave. I'm not saying you can't customize the shape of the wave, but compared to virtually every other towboat brand, you have less customization controls on a Malibu than any other brand. The only things you can control on a Malibu is, number one, the speed of the boat, which you can control on every boat. Number two is the wedge position. And wedge, where it's simulated ballast, just means you're adding or removing ballast on the fly. That's it. Those are the only two variables that you have the ability to control in order to create a surf wave. You can't control the lean or the pitch. You can, but you got to empty ballast to do it, and that takes a fair bit of time. So it's not something you can just do quickly on the fly in a couple seconds. You also can't independently control the shape of the lip of the wave. You are directly tying the shape of the wave to the size of the wave. So if you engage the wedge and take it up from a 1 to a 6, it's going to make a wave that's bigger. It's also going to be steeper. And so you cannot independently control the size and the shape. Now, with that being said, before you jump on and start throwing a bunch of stones at me, I'm not saying, like I said, the Malibu wave is not customizable. You can adjust things. You can make it longer by speeding up. You can make it taller by slowing down. You can make it bigger and steeper by engaging the wedge. You can make it smaller and more mellow by not engaging the wedge. That being said, you have significantly more customization abilities on literally any other boat because you can actually control the surf system. A Malibu Surfgate is just on or off. On a Mastercraft, as an example, you have that Surf Star system that you can engage, and it's got multiple settings, and depending on what you set those at, it's going to adjust the shape of the wave. You also can adjust the center plate very similarly to what you get the wedge, though it just has a slightly different application, but it's going to control the running attitude of the boat very similarly to what a wedge does. So there's advantages and disadvantages. A wedge is going to create more displacement, but it's also going to create significantly more drag. So there's a trade-off that gets there. The wedge works great. It's just you have that trade-off. So when you're comparing them, a Mastercraft has a significantly more customizable surf wave than a Malibu. So, and don't get mad at me, I've ridden behind both boats. I've driven both boats. I've missed with the wave on both boats. You have a lot more wave customization on a Mastercraft than you do a Malibu. It's not quite the level of, like, let's say a Centurion, but it's got a lot of wave customization beyond what a Malibu could do in shaping and tuning the lip of the wave, the size, the way that the wave functions at different parts of the wave, things of that nature. So you can really design and shape a wave that's more tuned to the exact activity that you're doing. So if you're a skim style rider, you can have a big, more mellow surf wave on a Mastercraft. That's an easier wave to create than it is on, let's say, a Malibu. So when we're talking about that, that is one of the big differences between Surfstar and Surfgate. And that really explains most of the difference between a Malibu and a Mastercraft as far as the surf capabilities of the boats. It's going to come down to the surf system. It's going to come down to how much ballast you can put in the boats. And it's going to come down to how you go through and set it up. So between the two, now as far as what I prefer, if I have enough weight in the boat, in other words, if I was adding additional weight beyond stock ballast, I would prefer to have a Mastercraft versus a Malibu from the surf experience. And this is if we're talking about like an X24 versus an M240, or if we're talking about a Malibu 23 LSV versus an XT23. If you were to optimize the boat, I would pick a Mastercraft. If I'm taking it out of the box and going to go with like 3 or 4 people and I'm not going to change anything, and if I have the additional plug and play bags in the Malibu, then I would pick the Malibu. So from a surf perspective, that's what I would rather surf behind. Now, I'm not saying I'd rather own one versus the other. I'm just saying that from a surf perspective, I'd rather ride on a Mastercraft wave that's fully optimized. I'd rather ride on a Malibu wave that is just straight out of the box without any adjustments or upgrades or changes or things of that nature. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, next thing to talk about is wakeboarding. So wakeboarding, you may or may not care about it, but the biggest difference between these two boats is going to be the shape of the wake. So between them, they both are great wakeboard boats. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of variables for wakeboarding depending on which model we're talking about here. But if we're talking about, let's say, a 23 LSV versus an XT23, the main difference between the boats is going to be the shape of the wake. So a Malibu is going to have a more vertical pitched up wake that's going to be going to buck you more straight up, where a Mastercraft is going to have a more rounded wake that's going to pitch you outwards. A Mastercraft wake is going to be better typically for beginner to intermediate level riders. And as well as it can be a really great wake, you just have to add a lot of weight to it to get it more advanced. For a Malibu, will have the ability to throw a better advanced wake out of the box. And we did some comparison videos where we compared a Centurion versus Malibu wakeboard wake. It's going to be very similar to a Mastercraft is much more in line with a Centurion wakeboard wake versus a Malibu. So it's going to be a little bit more rounded, which has it's you're not going to get that same kick and buck off the wake, but it also does give you a little bit longer landing zone. So it's going to be a little nicer on your knees. It's not going to be as dramatic when you hit the wake, which is going to be good for some, less good for others. It just depends on what you like. And certain people prefer different wakes. Some people really like a really pitchy wake. Some people really like a little bit more mellow wake. And that's just going to really come down to what your personal preference is from a wakeboard standpoint. Water skiing, this one's going to be really model dependent. So I don't want to do too much breaking it down. But if you're looking at, let's say, a Mastercraft XT21 or XT22 versus a Malibu 22 LSV, that was going to be a little bit tricky. I'd probably rather ski behind a Mastercraft because it's going to have a wake that's not as abrupt or as hard to hit. That won't have as much of a lip on it, but they're pretty close to one another. There's not one really clear winner between these two wakes. Both of them are all right from a recreational standpoint. If you jump up to like a Malibu M240 versus a Mastercraft X24, the Mastercraft would probably have a better water ski wake. I have not skied behind either of those boats. They both sound terrible to ski behind, so don't ski behind them. But if you want to just every once in a while go and have a recreational cruise on a ski, especially like, if you get a ski like an HO hovercraft or something like that, that's going to be just a floaty ski. You can go slow and just meander through the wakes and do that. That's a great thing to do behind either of these boats. But honestly, any of these boats. It works great. If you want to get after on a water ski, don't go after the real high-end surf boats. They're just not going to throw a great wake. But you're going to have pretty similar results between the ski wakes on them. Once again, this is going to depend a little bit on personal preference, but I would not make a decision of one boat versus the other based on the ski capabilities or based on recreationally skiing behind the boat. If you're an avid skier, then I would, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend either of those boats, or I'd recommend going and testing like a Mastercraft XT20 and a Malibu LX. So those are going to be the things that I would go and have a direct comparison between those different boats as far as which one I would prefer to ski behind at the speed and line length and things like that I would ski behind on. So hopefully that's a helpful thing to try and communicate that information over. So when we're talking about it, like I said, surf wave is going to depend on how you're wanting it set up and which one you're preferring. I personally, if I had to just go across the board, I would lean towards Mastercraft on the surf wave side of things, just mainly because of the customization capabilities that it has. If you're talking about the wakeboard wake comparison, I personally, I don't really wakeboard that much anymore, but back in the day, I would have actually gone a little bit more the Mastercraft route, something that's a little bit more mellow, as long as I could beef it up and make it bigger. If we're running like stock ballast on an XT23, and like 3 people, that may not be big enough for really getting after it on a wakeboard. But from that standpoint, if I could beef it up a lot, I would prefer the shape of the Mastercraft wake. And then skiing wise, going to be kind of 6s across the board between the different boats. So the last, so that one's that from a wake sports performance end. Now let's talk about driving and handling. So between the different boats, they both actually drive and handle pretty well as far as how nimble and quick they are, as well as handling them at slower speeds. After driving and spending a lot of time in them, they drive actually fairly similar to one another from what I've experienced. The big difference is that when you're out surfing and doing things, not having the wedge is a significant advantage to the Mastercraft, as well as the Mastercraft will have a better rough water ride than the Malibu. It's not dramatic. It's not anything like what you get with like a Centurion, but just that better build quality that you get on a Mastercraft, and some of the other things that they do to tweak the whole design slightly and have a little more dead rise in the boat is going to provide a slightly better rough water ride than what you get with a Malibu. So not a big difference, not a game changer for decision purposes, but that is something that would kind of sway me one direction versus the other. Last thing to talk about performance is engines. Honestly, between these two, it's a wash. I wouldn't necessarily go with one versus the other based on the motor. They're running basically the same engine platforms across the board. They're both running GM Marine engines. Difference is Malibu marinizes and sets up one. Ilmor runs and sets up the other one. I'm not privy enough to the information to know one versus the other as far as the reliability of either motor or things, but they're running the same platforms, the same engine models from General Motors. They're very, very similar. The only thing I would potentially lean towards is Ilmor has been marinizing the motors for a lot longer period of time, and from what I've heard reported, has less mechanical issues than Malibu does, just mainly because Malibu's like M5 and M6 platform, and particularly their LT4, that's one big difference, is if you're going to go that big LT4 motor, I would definitely go Ilmor versus Malibu, mainly because Malibu's drive system seems to have a lot more issues, where Ilmor, they beefed it up a bit more. So that's something to keep in mind between them, but there's not a clear winner in that discussion unless you're going to the LT4 platform, that bigger engine. So that's going to be kind of it. I potentially, if anything, I'd lean towards Ilmor on Mastercraft's end, just because of the time period that these motors have been running and how long they've been building them, where Malibu doesn't have a super long track record with the engines, and they haven't been around that long. So prior to that, Malibu was running Inmar engines, and so they were having a little different setup than, let's say, the one you get with their new Malibu platform, where they're marinizing their own motors. So last thing to discuss, since we covered pretty much everything from a performance standpoint, is the price tag between the boats. As I mentioned, here locally, where we're based in Utah, this may differ depending on where you're at in the country and how the boats are optioned and equipped. But really, you got fairly comparable pricing between the different boats. Between, like, let's say NXT versus Axis, LSV versus XT series, or MXZ versus XT series for that matter, and then M series versus X series, you can have fairly comparable pricing structures. There's some boats like Mastercraft has an X26. That's going to be more expensive than a 26 LSV, mainly just because you have cross category lines. And 26 LSV is not an ultra premium boat, and X26 is, where the LSV is a 26 footer. Mastercraft has a 25 footer, but they don't have a 26 footer that's in that mid-range segment XT. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking between them. There are some models that you can do apple-to-apple comparisons on, but when you can, they come in fairly similar price-wise. Mastercraft typically tends to be a little bit more expensive than Malibu, but that's not necessarily always the case, and it comes a lot down to the way the boats are optioned. Particularly on Mastercraft's end, they seem to have a wider variance of option levels, particularly on like the XT series boats and even the X series boats. So that's something you really keep in mind. I mean, you can have a option swing that'll swing the boat price $50,000, depending on where the boat's located in the country, what engine's in it, what features and options it has, and things of that nature. So ultimately, the last question at the end of the day, people ask me which boat I would pick. Now, if I'm in the market and if all I have is the ability to pick between a Malibu or a Mastercraft, this is my opinion. So if I had essentially an unlimited set of funds to spend, in other words, pricing is not really a hindrance or a barrier, I would personally probably buy a Mastercraft X24. So it's a great boat, surf's great, wakeboard's great. It's just a really nice, well-designed boat overall. I've spent a fair bit of time in that. I've spent a fair bit of time in similar size, similar option Malibus. I personally would prefer that Mastercraft versus a Malibu. If we're going in the mid-range stuff, like let's say, and I don't have, let's say my budget is capped at $200,000, I would probably lean towards a Malibu 23 LSV over an XT23, but that would be a real tough decision. I would be really looking between those two boats and kind of vetting them out, going side by side, just choosing which one I would prefer, going apples to apples. So that one is going to be more specific, but it would be kind of a tricky one for me to make a hard line decision on that one. There's aspects of each boat I like better. If I was planning on upgrading it and really dialing it in, I'd probably go with the Mastercraft. If I was just going to go out of the box, I'd probably go Malibu. So, but they're really close. And then between them, NXT Mastercraft versus Malibu, I would do an NXT 24. Personally, I think on the lower end side, I think that the NXTs are a significantly better built, better designed boat than an Axis is. I think there's aspects that you really lose out in when you go from a Malibu to an Axis in just build quality overall, and some of the different design elements. There's things that I really like on Malibu that are not apparent on Axis, but that's just my personal opinion. So between them, it's not something that I wouldn't be really mad about either of those decisions. There's not one that's a really clear winner in any of those categories for me, but that's just the boat I would personally pick if it was my opinion. I wouldn't necessarily be against a 22-footer or something along those lines. There's a few boats in each of the lines I really am not a big fan of. I don't really like the 26-footers for either option for totally different reasons, I might add. The Mastercraft X26, I don't think performs at the level that I would want to in that price of a boat. And the Malibu 26 LSV, I just really don't like the way that boat was designed. I think the 25 LSV is a significantly better boat, but that's just my personal opinion. So there's different areas and different things and different size breakdowns of each one. Honestly, if I was only restricted to where I could only buy one boat out of any of those, and I couldn't buy the ProStar or a Malibu Response TXI, because those are the ones I would pick, I would actually probably pick a Malibu LX. And the reason why is because that boat is their crossover edition boat. It's, in my opinion, probably the best crossover edition boat of any of the boat manufacturers. It's the only one that skis at a decent level that also has actual surf capabilities. There's other ones that have surf capabilities, supposedly, according to the market materials, but that I've actually surfed behind, and I would just not surf if I had to surf behind one of those. Where the Malibu LX, I would actually probably surf behind. It's not that bad of a surf wave. It's not something I want to really get after it as far as surfing, but it does a decent job surfing. So this is a lot of info. Hopefully it's been helpful for you. Hopefully it's been helpful to get kind of an unbiased look and opinion, at least if nothing else, give you a better insight as to why I have the thoughts and opinions that I do that might influence your thoughts and opinions when you're looking at these two boat brands, or honestly any other boat brands, and just having a better idea. May even give you some better ideas of how to set up or how to run your current boat. So I hope this information is really helpful for you. If you want to get more information like this, jump on boardco.com, subscribe to our newsletter. We'll go through and send you new content as it comes out. Go and check us out on YouTube. Subscribe to us on YouTube as well as all the other social platforms. And you can keep up with all the stuff that we're doing, as well as if there's additional information you'd like us to cover in the future, go through and leave us a comment on YouTube. We look at every single one of those, and we'll be happy to go through and respond to them if needed and give you, and we look at them, we take the input into consideration. We're happy to give you the information that you want. So thanks a ton for spending some time with me. I really appreciate it. You have a good one, and we'll talk soon.